This is Necropolis 28, a miniature skirmish game played on a compact 40 by 40 centimeters area. An area that needs to be built. That means in this video I'm going to show you how I finished my board for this incredible game. Hello and welcome back to Lenric's Realm. A few weeks ago I embarked on this project with one goal in mind: to create a detailed diorama gaming board featuring multiple levels, spanning both an underground area and some overground ruins. In my previous video I covered the basic board construction and the complete build of the underlying area. So with that being said, let's dive into the construction of the ruined overground. I used these MDF kits from Cromlech's frostgrave line for the ruins, and in preparation for this videos I went all in at their store, resulting in this huge pile of MDF. However, in the end I only needed 2 buildings from 2 of the kits. The smaller houses were from the Haunted Houses set, while the Tudor style building and the tower were from the Silent Tower kit. Unfortunately I had to opt for the smaller tower, as the namesake tower from this kit was way too big for this board. It's also worth noting that these already look quite good with just a coat of paint. The pre-existing texture makes them tabletop ready fairly quickly. And if you want to get these for your tabletop, you can follow the link down below. This is an affiliate link that gives you a 5% discount on everything you buy at the Cromlech store directly, and also supports my channel a bit. Now, as detailed as they are, I still prefer my buildings even more detailed. Especially in this build where the diorama aspect somewhat necessitates it. To achieve this higher level of detail you can go several routes. You can, for example, use XPS foam to cover the MDF and carve texture into that with a ballpoint pen. In this build I opted to go with singular bricks made from 2mm and 6mm cork sheets. It's the same technique I used while building the underground area. You simply cut the pieces to size and glue them in place with PVA. For the 6mm thick bricks I also added an intermediate step where I smoothed out all the visible edges to enhance the look of these bricks. Here I would also suggest keeping the larger chunks that will inevitably break off while doing this. These will be handy in a later step. To finish the look I used a wire brush to rough up the cork a bit, and used a mixture of tile grout, PVA, water and black paint to fill in the gaps of the stonework and also add even more texture to the piece. Another step you can take is to add fine-grained texture paste to various areas. I mostly used this to simulate the plaster walls of the inside of the tower and the Tudor style ruin, as well as the outside of the latter. If you have seen my video regarding my tabletop houses, you probably recognize this technique. First I applied the paste, and after that I used small sponge bits to smooth out the surface and to give it a typical plaster look. On the board itself I used 3cm thick styrofoam to add the elevated areas. I could have gone with a honeycomb board from the last build, but I felt the thickness of these particular EPS sheets was ideal for what I had in mind. First I glued them in place with the EPS glue and used a handheld wire cutter to cut off the overlap. The resulting cut wasn't as smooth as I hoped though, so I decided to cover the edges with cork pieces. And for that I needed to make space by removing more of the EPS. At that point I also added the smaller houses that would serve as the entrance to the underground ossuary. First I drilled 3cm wide holes into each house using a hole saw drill bit, which you can find at any hardware store. I began by drilling a smaller hole and used it as a guide for a larger bit. After that, I made the probably not so ideal choice of gluing these houses in place before making any modifications to them. In hindsight, I should have added the texture work first. Luckily, I didn't decide to do this with the larger buildings, as this would have complicated this build, and while filming this build, even more. With all that in place, it was time for the brickwork, at least for most of it. First, I covered the outer edges with the platforms with cork bricks. These were deliberately a bit longer than the thickness of the EPS sheets, as I wanted to add a thin layer of sculptor mold on top of these platforms. Afterward, I went back to the small entrance houses. Here I made sure to leave the broken edges untouched, while I covered the straight edges with appropriate size cork pieces. To create the illusion of bricked up corners, I incorporated thicker 6mm pieces in a somewhat alternating pattern. I also made sure to use varying brick sizes to make these ruins look even more chaotic, but also more natural. Now, to reach the upper side of the platforms, I needed some sort of access. For that, I decided to have stairs on one platform and a simple slope on the other. The approach for both was pretty easy. First, I marked the appropriate area and used a cutting knife to remove the EPS either completely or to form an appropriate slope. The stairs were then simply realized by stacking fitting cork pieces on top of each other. As for the slope, here I used my hot foam cutter to burn about 1 cm broad gaps on each side. These would come in handy later when I would cover the whole platform with bricks. To break up the monotony of the edges, I decided to incorporate 2 old water drains. For these, I simply took a larger chunk of cork and cut out a half circle on one side. The remaining cork piece was then cut into smaller parts, treated like all the other 6mm bricks, and then glued to a piece of black cardboard. After that, I used wooden skewers to act as bars, and with that I covered the rest of the platform edges. And while I do that, let me please welcome our newest patron. Thank you, C.W. Jones. With your small contribution of €3 or dollars, you help me run this channel and create more videos. If you also enjoy my videos and want to support me, you can do so by joining Patreon as well. You get exclusive access to previews, behind the scenes material, and the chance to vote on upcoming projects. But even if not, I'm already incredibly thankful for you watching this video. So why not hit the subscribe button if you want to see more videos like this. Again, thank you all for your support, and now let's get back to the board. Now, with the cork pieces in place, I added the aforementioned layer of sculptor mold to cover the upper side of the EPS. This also has the added benefit of making the surface a bit uneven, which gives these platforms a much more natural look. After this was dry, I finished the cork step by adding more pieces. Here I mostly concentrated on paving the walkways. After the PVA set, I again roughed up the surface with a wire brush and generously applied my grout texture mix on top of it. It's important to fill the edges. You can always wipe away the excess if you apply too much. At that point I wanted to fix the houses to their designated spot. There was only a slight problem with that. As you can see, the underside of the houses is completely even, which results in a slight problem if you want to put this on an uneven surface. So I use cork bricks to raise the buildings on their edges. This at least guarantees the building standing on 2 or more edges and not wobbling on a raised bit somewhere in the middle. This also gave them a foundation, which seemed appropriate. I fixed them in place with PVA and filled any resulting gap with air drying clay. It's also ideal to get smoother transition in the corners if you want to fill those with a bit of clutter. Especially when you think of a ruined town, it's highly unlikely that these corners would be clean and tidy. Which brings me to a step that, in my opinion, stands out as one of the most enjoyable aspects of this build. First, I took popsicle sticks and trimmed them to match the length of the planks on the MDF buildings. I also beveled the edges using my hobby knife. Deliberately breaking some of these planks in half was the next step, creating a collection of, well, broken planks. The resulting wood splinters were also great as clutter, so I made sure to keep those as well. At that point I also mixed the collected corks, chips and bits with a bit of coarse grit sand. Now with all this and a bit of fine sand together, I could start the process of adding the ground texture and clutter. Applying all that followed a very simple pattern. First applying PVA, then adding a few wood chips or a broken plank, followed by the cork sand mix, which I would then finish with fine sand on top of it. After letting the PVA set, I used my vacuum cleaner to remove all the loose sand and doused the whole area with isopropyl alcohol. Thanks to this, the watered down PVA I applied on top of it seeps deeper into the grid and ensures a tighter bond. I applied this all over the board, including the interiors of the ruins, where I also added a few still intact wood planks. Additionally, I applied the cork sand mix to the fractured edges of the ruins to accentuate their shattered appearance. And as the last step, before painting this whole thing, I collected a few appropriate plastic bits, mostly shields, weapons and pieces of armor, and scattered them throughout the board. So first I primed the whole construction in brown, making sure to cover everything except of course the already finished underground. Speaking of which, as I started out to paint the stonework, I used the exact same steps I used on the stonework in my previous video. So if you want all the details on this bit, you should definitely check that out. For the ground texture, I started with a base coat of dark green. Subsequently, I applied highlights using light brown, olive green, and ochre yellow through dry brushing. As for the wooden parts, here I used a warm off-white for overbrushing. Essentially a dry brush technique with a more generous amount of paint. For this step I employed cheap brushes and applied the paint in the same direction as the wood grain. I also used a similar approach to paint the plaster on the walls. To finish the wood, you can take a transparent paint such as Army Painter Speed Paints and glaze it over the wood. This yields a simple yet effective miniature wood texture. To finish the ground and clutter, I used a self-made brown wash to tone down the color and add more definition. My basic approach to washes is pretty simple. Most of the time I use transparent inks mixed with a lot of water, a bit of acrylic medium and a bit of flow improver. Just like the violet ink mix I'm mixing here for the stonework. At that point I painted a few more details, focusing mainly on the metallic part, and proceeded to the next step of applying pigment powders. For this I primarily used 3 colors: light yellow ochre, faded olive green and burnt umber for the ground, clutter, as well as here and there on the already dry brushed stonework. and this dark red ochre served as a simple way to introduce rust colors on the metallic shields and weapons. In the end, I locked the pigments in place with isopropyl alcohol. While finishing this project, a last-minute idea struck me to set the scene in a winter setting. Consequently, I purchased a large container of snowflock from Woodland Scenics. Though one could go completely wild and cover everything with this, I opted for a more restrained approach, drawing inspiration from the packaging shots of the MDF kits. Additionally, I had some winter tufts lying around that seemed perfect for this scenario. So I simply covered an appropriate area with PVA, added 1 or 2 tufts and then applied the snow on top of it. And after letting the glue dry and removing all the excess, my Necropolis 28 board was finally ready for battle. This really was a passion project for me, showcasing a great game and also checking off a project on my hobby bucket list. I hope you found this video enjoyable and maybe feel inspired to try out Necropolis 28 for yourself. You find a link to this game down below, and though it leads to a Patreon site, you don't need to pay a single dime for this. And if you do so, please consider giving the video a like, sharing it, and of course leaving a comment. Also, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to stay updated with my latest projects. And remember, if you want to get your hold on 1 or 2 of these Cromlech MDF kits, you can use my affiliate link down below to get a 5% discount. Also, for those who want to see more of my projects, you can check out this video right here. Thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Until then, farewell, fellow adventurers.